All right, thanks everybody. So welcome to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for bias, ethical risk, and effective governance. I'm super excited today to have Frida Polli here. Frida is formerly the CEO of Pymetrics, and is now, which has now been acquired by Harver, and you're now the chief
data science officer.
Data science officer. So let me ask you real quick, how many chief data science officers are there? I feel like this is not a common title.
Probably not. But I think it just reflects the growing importance of, the field, and an understanding of, how the data and the algorithms that you're using matter in the field of HR, so I think probably not a lot, but certainly indicates, I think, that platforms like Harver are really prioritizing building responsible algorithms. So
yeah, so not
kudos to them.
One of the first, but probably not the last. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so let me ask you a little bit. I'm curious actually to hear a little bit about your journey. Like, how did you get here? From your background, working on your PhD to Pymetrics, and now moving on. So what's the story?
The founder story. Yeah. So, I was an academic scientist at Harvard and MIT for a decade. Really enjoyed the neuroscience we were doing. We were putting people in MRI machines and scanning their brains and learning really lots of interesting things about them. I think at the end of the day, I realized that I am more of like an engineer, not like as in like I like to code, but like an engineer as in like engineers like to make stuff and test it out. And I think as a pure researcher, you don't have that opportunity. And so I felt stymied in the ability to like actually take all of this knowledge and then build something that could do something. And so I transitioned out of academia through an MBA program at Harvard, and it was there, and I was trying to figure out like, okay, what kind of stuff could we do with our technology? And it was there that I saw recruiting firsthand and realized like, oh, wow, like this is pretty antiquated and there's a lot of information, that's missing in this process. And the bulk of what I saw as missing was really what we had been perfecting, measuring in the lab for decades, which are soft skills, what in HR are called soft skills, right? So sort of cognitive, personality, socio-emotional, anything that's sort of not a learned or a hard skill, right? So if you think of a hard skill as being like the things I know how to do, or where I went to college, or what my GPA was, or what my last job was, those are all things that I've learned how to do. They're acquired. Versus when we think of soft skills, it's more things that are more innate in me as a person, right? Am I a more spontaneous versus a methodical planner, or I'm more impulsive or methodical in my attentional style and things like that? So that's what I saw at HBS, was just that everyone's resume looked the same and really wasn't very informative about whether they would or would not be a good fit to whatever careers they were looking at. And people were trying to assess these soft skills via these antiquated and I would say pretty biased methods, like taking people out for coffee chats or having your classmates spy on you and like, indicate who would be a good fit for Bain, and some secret spreadsheet. I mean, I'm not kidding. That's like how they were assessing it. And so seeing that, I was like, oh, well, there's lots of room for improvement. And so we actually built the first version of Pymetrics when I was still in business school, and my classmates, all of whom love, assessment, were the first sort of guinea pigs that went through it. And that's how we built our data set. And that's how we learned sort of initial things about the data we were collecting and how well it predicted success, et cetera, et cetera. And then, that's sort of the initial story. And then, in 2013, we raised our first round of outside funding, and we're kind of off to the races. And then we I built Pymetrics from 2013 to last year when we were acquired by Harver.
And so how do you think, so going from 2013, but even before then, looking at the field of sort of higher tech, or the use of AI in hiring, like how's it changed from then to now? Like,
Yeah.
what are the big differences?
Totally. Well, I mean, I think that like when I knew nothing about HR. I was not a domain expert. What I knew was sort of the science piece of things, right? The science could be applied to many things, right? And we just decided HR could be the place we would apply it. But I would say behavioral science was my expertise. So then like understanding how all of this fit into HR was a learning experience for me. And I think that, it's been quite a journey. I think, as with many things, I think AI wasn't really on anyone's radar screen back in 2013, or few people's radar screen, right? And I think it's also, I have this joke that, AI is like teenage sex. Everyone says they're doing it, but nobody really knows what it is, right? And I'd say that's still true, like in 2023. So I think like the use of AI, we saw increasing, or machine learning, AI, whatever, we saw increasing, steadily as we built out pymetrics. I think, concomitant with that, there was a media, sort of frenzy and freak out about AI in this space that was sort of rising steadily. And again, I think not always warranted. I mean, sometimes warranted, sometimes really not warranted, et cetera. And so therefore, like public awareness of this. Anyway, so I guess, yes, many things changed over that period of time. And I think one of the things that maybe was interesting for us, like my co-founder and I, we're both women. I don't know if that impacted the way we thought about things, but we sort of built in this debiasing technique from basically the first well, maybe not the first, but certainly the first product algorithm that we built, right? Like, and, we did that for many reasons. I mean, we consulted with the EEOC in 2012 or 2013 and said, how can we make sure that we're staying on the right side of regulation? And I'll never forget. And I wish I had my notes as to like who this person was. It was like basically not a commissioner. It was like somebody who did investigations. And the person said, well, if you don't want to be sued, don't work with companies that discriminate. And I was like, oh, well, that sounds pretty straightforward. But I think basically what he was, trying to say is just adopt best practices as per UGESP and, et cetera, et cetera. So bottom line is we, from the very beginning, had a focus on being compliant and, both because we wanted to be compliant, but also just from like a moral or ethical standpoint, it was like kind of the right thing to do, right? The more we were in market, the more we realized like, first of all, there's a lot of older tools that really didn't prioritize that. Forget about machine learning being the problem. It's just, not sort of having bias or disparate impact in hiring technology was not a priority of many solutions out there. And secondly, with the introduction of machine learning, people were not necessarily debiasing or using any kind of, techniques. And, then what I would say about that is like, it was a huge journey, honestly, just even in that regard, because we don't hear this as much anymore. And it was actually interesting to view that EOC discussion a few weeks ago that you sent me, right? But I would say the first 3-4 years, people were like, especially employment lawyers, especially management side attorneys, were very sort of like, oh, well, you could be tripping, anti-discrimination laws with debiasing, and like just really quite negative about any kind of technological approach to looking at and removing bias, which to me felt very misguided, because it's like, well, that's silly. You know what I mean? Like, of course we're going to do this, and of course you can do it in a way that, doesn't trip these anti-discrimination laws. But like, I would say there's still probably some employment lawyers out there that still would make the argument that trying to debias, could trip that. Although I think, EEOC was pretty clear couple of weeks ago that there's certain forms that don't trip that. But that was what, 2023, and we're talking about 2013 when we first started doing it. So that was like a long journey in and of itself, right? And I think one of the things we learned is that the law and science oftentimes I would say almost always don't think about things in the same way. Like a scientist thinks, or machine learning person thinks, how can I do this? And a lawyer thinks, should I do this? And the answer oftentimes to the how can I is like, I can do it, and I should, and I will. And the lawyer is like, you shall not do it because we don't want to know, right? And this came up even recently in a phone call that we had, so it was part of this technical advisory committee. on AI that Vicky Lipnick chaired. And, after the whole report was done, we got on a few calls with reporters, and I think it was on a call with Bloomberg. Somebody said, I don't remember how this came up, but basically it was a monitoring AI. And I mean, I basically just said, look, if you wanted to monitor AI in real time, technically you absolutely could do that. Like, you, not only AI, you could monitor any HR platform in real time. That is 1,000,000% feasible today. You know what I mean? And the lawyer on the phone was like, well, I really don't think we should be doing that. Like, just started going off on like, no, we shall not do that. But, so again, it's like, and there are obviously reasons that you may not want to do that for sort of other reasons. But all I'm trying to say is I think machine learning / science in general versus regulation and employment law and all the rest of it are oftentimes not thinking about things the same way. And so you're really trying to thread a needle between what you think should be done and what you think is the right thing to do versus the feedback you're getting from folks that have to, who are advising your corporate clients on how to use these technologies and how to think about certain aspects of it. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
Like, as a person, I found that quite frustrating, and I still find it frustrating. I'm not saying I don't understand their perspective. And I don't think this is limited to, HR. I think this is across the board. Like, I think science is about what's possible. The law is about what happened in the past, and what happened in the past is not always it's about precedent, right? Like, well, are you going to get sued? Well, let's look at the last, 10 years or 20 years of case law. And what happened in the past isn't always what you hope happens in the future. So you're really just talking about two very different perspectives on a problem. So
Yeah.
it's a very long-winded way of saying, what have I seen evolve? I've seen many, many things evolve, but I think this fundamental tension between the law and science or like science, technology, whatever you want to call it, and what can be done versus what should be done versus what is being advised to be done there's a huge chasm, I would say. So, and
Yeah.
we'll see that with the New York City law, which I'm sure we're going to cover, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, so we can move on a little bit. So, I mean,
but we don't have to. I'm just saying, like, I think
yeah,
it's in broad, like clear display
yeah.
there, right? So,
Well, I think so I mean, it's kind of two kinds of laws, let's put it this way. There's the old law, right, which has been around for a long time, anti-discrimination law everywhere, pretty much in Western society. And enter AI, right? And now we are getting a new wave of lawmaking, a new wave of discussions by regulators on what to do about AI. And
sorry, it's again, I want to make this clear. The New York City law is around automation. It has become labeled an AI bill, but it's really about automation, which in the early days of the law actually covered non-machine learning technology. And again, I just want to make this point very clearly, because HR automation has been around for half a century. I mean, that's partly why EEOC and civil rights and everything else, because like the earliest form of HR automation is testing, right? It's like, the kind of testing that you do for getting into schools, like SATs and GREs. There's these pre-employment tests that are basically the same thing, but instead of getting you into school, they get you into a job, right? And I think that was the earliest form of HR automation. And I think that is what UGESP and, Title VII and all the rest of it were aimed at addressing, right? Because again, like EEOC has, like, the way that they look at human bias, right, is very different than the way they look at automated or, test bias, right? And so I just want to mention that, because I think like AI is a great boogeyman to make everyone freak out and be like, oh my God, like we need to deal with this. But the problem is, it's been going on for a very long time, right? And, Joe Fuller, for example, at HBS has done some really great work on this research that he's called missing workers, just showing that these like really pretty dumb like keyword search algorithms that are not machine learning, they're just looking for certain keywords in resumes. So there's no machine learning whatsoever, are very exclusionary, right? But again, because people are more freaked out about AI or machine learning, like we're not maybe focused on this as much, right? And so the point being, I think, A couple things. I think it's not a bad thing that this freak out about AI has garnered heightened attention to these tools. I think that's a good thing overall, right? And it's true that the more sophisticated versions of these HR technologies could be, and I say could be because I really don't believe that they are necessarily. I'm just saying there are some versions of them that could be more problematic. The downside, and you've heard me say this many times, is that there are like old tools like the Wonderlic, which is a very traditional standardized test, just like the SAT, that has massive disparate impact. I mean, they only select 3 out of every, African Americans for every 10 Caucasians, and it's like 4 Hispanics for every 10 Caucasians. So huge disparate impact. Like, it's not trivial. And yet, these new laws will likely exclude those types of tools from being audited because they don't have machine learning. And I mean, you've made this case yourself, like in previous podcasts, which is like, at the end of the day, automation is automation, right? If you're going to call something automated, does it really matter how they perform that automation? And I would say the answer is no. Like, literally, you could have some, yeah. So the point that I was going to make, which is that I think that it's good we have heightened scrutiny, but I think we're going to get this weird situation, at least for some period of time, maybe not forever, where newer things will be built and have to comply with certain standards, old ones will not, and it's going to create a very odd. It would be like, oh, those diesel engines, they don't need to comply with emission standards, but hey, that Tesla does. It's like, well, why? Probably the diesel engine is a lot worse than the Tesla, So
Yep.
Going to be
No,
an issue.
that does make sense. I want to point out to everybody, if you have questions for us, you want to put it in the Q&A, please feel free to do it at any time. So yeah, this is really interesting point. I think, I'm glad you brought it up. I do think that, I mean, even, beyond the New York City law, even if you look at what's happening in the EU, it's called the EU AI Act, and
Totally.
they're really kind of hyper-focused on, what's the right definition for AI or machine learning.
Which is just like, why are we doing that? Like, to me, it's just so senseless, right? Like, why are we now becoming, policemen around what is or is not AI, when ultimately, like, we should be focused on outcomes, not process. It's a process. In my opinion, you should have an outcome audit, not a process audit. You know what I mean? And if something is automated, I don't think it really matters what the sophistication of the automation is. And in fact, we know, this is why I said, like, this concern around AI, like, I think there's some things that could be problematic, like scraping social media data or looking at like facial features and whether that predicts job success. I mean, there've been some really bad examples of things, no, you shouldn't do, but that has more to do with the data than the actual machine learning, but whatever. But then I think, again, it's like, I really think it's flawed. And again, I think it's really misguided to focus so much on like, what is the precise, because then that's all they focus on. And you saw that with the New York City law as well, right? It's like, everyone's going to make the argument that like, oh no, my tool does or does not, meet the definition. And now all of a sudden you're a policeman as to whether you are not something that has to be regulated, as opposed to like having a broader definition and just, like, why shouldn't some of these older tools, have to, produce an audit? I mean, to me, it doesn't really, make a whole ton of sense. And the other thing I wanted to say, because you had brought this up, like, this anti-discrimination law has been around forever. Absolutely. The problem with anti-discrimination law, at least in the US, I'm not as familiar with the EU, but I think it's probably very similar, is it's a voluntary compliance scheme, right? That's very similar to the EPA. It's a voluntary compliance scheme. So what does that mean? So it's very similar to like, they don't have time and or motivation to go and, check on everyone that's saying, yes, I'm complying with, with federal regulation. And so they really, very much similar to the EPA, they rely on sort of these, I would say, big, not scandals, maybe not the right word, but these huge instances of things going wrong, potentially, quote unquote, to then focus on like who to investigate. And again, I think there's a lot of, tools that, fly, like the Wonderlic. I mean, the Wonderlic has a ton of disparate impact and, like, it's still around, it's still legal. And again, it's legal because there's this loophole that says, well, if you predict outcomes, you can have disparate impact, and it's like, okay, but there's also a part of the law that says you should be using the least biased alternative. And there are far less biased alternatives out there now than the Wonderlic. And I'm just picking on the Wonderlic, but they're just an example of a cognitive test that has a tremendous amount of bias, right? Racial bias. So the point is simply that it's a voluntary compliance scheme. And therefore, as we see with EPA, very hard to actually be super effective in reducing and eliminating the types of discrimination. And again, that's no fault of EEOC. That's just because that's how it was structured. You know what I mean? Unlike the FDA, where it's like proactive, right? You have to meet certain standards, and only then can you actually like sell your product in market, right? So
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, so the EU will sort of start introducing this you know, a little bit more forceful compliance, but there's a lot of worries that will be you know, also very superficial document exercise, which I think we all agree is not ideal.
Yep.
So what do you think are your, so you know, we have the law, we have the legal side, we have the people like you working to build these tools, and then there's this sort of other group now, which is the people raising the alarm about AI. And so like, if to talk to those people who are very worried about potential bias, potential misuse of AI in hiring in other places, and you know, what's your response to those worries? Like, do you feel, you know, what do they need to know about AI and used in hiring? I mean, from your experience, of course, you can't speak about every company, but how do you put them at ease to say, it's not as bad as you think?
Well, I don't think I would say that. I mean, I would say two things. I would say, you really, like, AI is like electricity. You could be used to kill someone. It could be used to heat your house. I mean, so I wouldn't provide any kind of blanket statement about AI. It could be horrible. I have no idea. Like, it could be killing you. You know, metaphorically. So I think it is a step in the right direction to have some sort of a framework to evaluate these tools on, right? And whether it's, you know, New York City or, you know, some other, you know, sort of municipal and state level, you know, bills and whatnot, you know, that are in the works, I think that's a good thing. So I wouldn't say, oh, don't worry about it, because I do think that there's potentially lots of ways to misuse it. My only thing I would say is, like, you should worry about the stuff that has been around forever too, because I mean, you don't really need to do anything other than to look at the workforce to know that, you know, there is bias in many of these tools. And so all I would say is, like, hey guys, this isn't a new thing. Like, freak out, definitely freak out, but then expand your definition of what you think is problematic. I think that's really all I would say, you know?
Yeah. I like that.
I don't have any issue with people, quote unquote, freaking out. I just think that hopefully they're thinking about it more broadly, because I think sometimes it gets very, you know, specific, and it just doesn't, I think, again, it's just like emissions, right? It's like, you know, CO2 emissions, like, we should take into account all the vehicles that have been around, even if they were constructed, you know, in the 1970s. And when, you know, like, think about, like, you know, the Clean Air Act or any of these, you know, like, sort of, you know, sort of really game-changing pieces of regulation. Like, I did some research on the Clean Air Act one time, and you know, basically the federal government commissioned a study, I think, for like 10 years before that was kind of put into effect, to see, like, okay, what is happening right now? Like, do we have pollution? Where is it coming from? What are the sources? And I think that's a little bit what is missing, is that people are, like, freaking out about, like, this particular smokestack, for example, without realizing, hey, there's a whole bunch of other ones over here that we haven't even considered, right? And I don't know how we fix that. I do think that's why some of, like, for example, the New York City bill, the fact that people are now going to need to produce audits, and look, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I'm sure everyone's going to try to get out of it if they do have bias, or they're going to try to fudge the numbers, they're going to do this, whatever. But it's a step in the right direction of saying, like, we need to see how your tool is performing, because that's the first step of knowing if there's a problem, is just understanding, like, what is the output of your tool and how's it doing, you know?
Yeah. So let's move on to New York a little bit, because there are a ton of issues there with the law, and we don't know yet how it's going to pan out, right? The rulemaking is not done. One thing that struck me as interesting, that's kind of relevant for this conversation, that you said earlier, was the response from the EEOC person that you had talked to about, you know, don't work with employers who discriminate, right? Of course, that's really hard to make any kind of decision about that when you're trying to interact with a potential client or something. But in the New York City law, there is a delicate relationship between the employer and the vendors who produce these tools. Like, how do you see what do you see as the big kind of problems here that need to get sort of sorted out? Like what do you think are the big things that could happen that would be problematic that we might need clarity on? Let's say if somebody came and said, hey, why don't you finish writing this law for us?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, look, they're probably an infinite number, right? So, but let's just start with the things. The biggest issues, as I see, are the biggest thing for me was the narrowing of the definition, because again, now all of a sudden New York City is now going to become the police person of who is or who does and does not fit that definition. That is, in my opinion, a bad use of their resources. Like, meaning that's all you're like, you're now going to need to be the arbiter of who needs to comply or not, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because you've made it so narrow, right? If you had left it much broader, I think what they could have and also done is just said, look, if you currently fall under the purview of EEOC, right? If you would need to be worried about whether you're compliant with UGESP, you should be complying with the New York City law. They didn't do that. There's lots of tools that know that they have to be compliant with UGESP that now are thinking, oh, I'm not, going to need to be compliant with New York City, the Wonderlic, let's pick on them for another hot second. But again, many older tools. So that I think is the biggest problem that I see, is that I think they should have provided much clearer guidance, much broader guidance. And I think they could have done it. And this is apparently something that the EU has done in the past, is said, here are examples of things that need to comply. And I think it could have been easy to say, look, anything that's currently covered by EEOC is going to be covered by New York. Like, I don't know what, like, that would be so simple. It's like every lawyer knows whether they do or do not need to comply with UGESP and Title VII, and I don't know. So I think that was a huge miss, again, they still have time to rectify it. Like, who knows if they will or they won't. So to my mind, that was probably the biggest thing. The things I think they did right is they didn't try to water down the reporting that was required. It needs to be, publicly available. It needs to be, understandable by the general public. I think there was a lot of kerfuffles, people being like, I mean, look, at the end of the day, like, I think you and I are both aware, and I think we can say this publicly, that employers are aware that there is a lot of bias in some subset of the tools they use. Like, that's just a fact. And I think they are worried about that. Like, we all know that they are worried about that. And so the push from management side attorneys has been to really narrow the definition, and it's all there in public testimony. So we're not speaking out of school, so that hopefully whatever they're using doesn't need to be audited, which is a strategy, of course. And for whatever reason, that's the direction that the definition has gone, is to become more and more narrow, right? So who knows what will end up happening? I think it's unfortunate that people realize there's a lot of bias in their tools, and their response has been, oh, let's just make sure we're not one of those ones that needs to be audited. I think that's super unfortunate. Hopefully people's mentality will evolve over time to say, hey, look, there's a lot of good stuff out there in market that doesn't have, disparate impact, and we should be gravitating towards that, or we should be building that, ourselves. And I'm sure some subset of employers hopefully will move in that direction. And hopefully that will be, because again, New York's just one of what I think will probably be many, and maybe something happens at the federal level too, who knows, right? So I think, I think that, like, I don't know, I'm maybe being a one-note piano, but I think that to me is one of the bigger issues. I know some people have had a problem with, allowing for group level or employer aggregated reporting. People have worried about that, saying, oh, you could be a bad actor and hiding behind something, and this, that, and the other. It's true. That's possible. I actually think that a aggregate platform level audit is a step in the right direction. The reason I say that is because there are some platforms that always have disparate impact. I've mentioned one repeatedly. I won't say their name again. And there are others that basically almost never do or never do. And it's a little bit silly to be like thinking that if employer, like the usage of this platform by employer A versus employer B is going to change that. So I think putting the responsibility, because what it does is shift some of the responsibility onto the builder of the tool. And I think that's fair. Like, if you're going to build a tool, I think you should be more responsible and on the hook for how it performs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, well, I gave it to so-and-so and they did something. And so, it's be like a car manufacturer being like, well, Shea, I sold it to you and I don't know what you did with it. So, I can't, there are no reps and warranties on this thing. And I think that that's a little, that those types of regulations were built for a time when HR platforms that have global reach didn't exist, right?
Yeah.
They were built for a time when every Joe Schmo was building their own little thing at employer A. And so of course that made a lot more sense. So that I think actually was a move in the right direction. Now, look, there's so many ways that I think people can try to get out of it, could try to fudge the numbers, could do this, could do that. I mean, that's a whole nother area of debate that I have less input on, because I know what we're doing. We're not trying to fudge the numbers. We're just being straight shooters, like, here are numbers, here's what you got. But I'm sure there's all sorts of ways that people will try to, comply, but maybe not as, just do some stuff that would be great,
So would you be, I mean, do you think we need a federal level regulation on this? Like, you think that would be helpful, or do you think that some of the activities at the state and city level are going to be enough to just nudge us enough in the right direction that we're going to get it right?
Well, so what often happens with state and city level stuff is that if it becomes a little bit of the standard, right? Because, most platforms will have to comply with this, and therefore, like, it'll just be, they'll have to bake that in, right? So that's, quote unquote, an advantage of these types of situations, is they are going to push the boundaries, right? The challenge obviously is that, it's a patchwork of regulations. New York has one thing, Washington has another, California, and then it's just a mess, complete shit show. So that's not ideal. And I think, honestly, I think people have spoken about the New York City law with that in mind, being like, this is precedent setting. We don't want it to set a really strong precedent, which is why, employer groups and, other people like that have really tried to water it down, because they didn't want some really like strong precedent to be set. And, again, I think unfortunately all I'm saying is the new regulations have gone in that direction, that we'll leave it at that. So do I think a federal thing is necessary? I mean, given how divided our politics are, I think it might be challenging to produce, right? And I think that's why you see states like California, like, taking charge of, sort of climate change initiatives and, like, et cetera, because they just know that, like, nothing's going to happen at the federal level. So therefore, we're just going to do it on our own. So in an ideal world, I would say, yeah, that would be great. But in a practical world, I'm not sure how realistic that is. So that's what I would say, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we do have a question. So this is about HR tech, which is clearly privacy invasive. So things like sentiment analysis, persistent employee monitoring, some unscientific tools, like potentially trying to get personality traits from video interviews.
Yeah.
And, do you see these things as problematic, or is this just a continuation of sort of what's been happening?
Well, it's both. I mean, I think it is very problematic, right? I think it's stalkery to be scraping all sorts of social media data, or, people are buying data. People are going to data brokers and buying data about you and using that without your knowledge, right? I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that's happening, and people are not aware. So, and or like, looking at whether you raise an eyebrow and trying to, predict personality from that. Like, so I think there's all sorts of stuff. Like I said, like, I think that is, to me, less about the machine learning component. It's more about it's the data piece that's problematic, right? So I think that is problematic. And I would also say that crappy ways of evaluating people have been around forever and continue to be around. So it's not like I don't have it's not like I'm not concerned about all of this stuff. I just think, again, it's just back to, like, what is ground truth? Like, I think a lot of times when we have these discussions, it's like, everything was perfect until AI came along. It's like, no, definitely not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I do have concern. And I also think that we've had, unfortunately, a history as a society of doing these types of things even before ML was around, so.
Yeah, for sure. Discrimination is not new. Invasion of privacy is not new.
Exactly. Yeah. And the employee surveillance tools, like, yeah, I mean, again, I don't know not much about them, but I do think that, I think what's interesting it being kind of I use that word in a kind of a loaded way, but like employee surveillance tools have been used on blue collar workers for a long time. Now the difference, I think, is they're being used in white collar populations. And I think there's more of like a pushback, again, now that it means that we're a classless society, no doubt, right? But I think maybe it's a good thing, because then, traditionally these types of things have been sort of, tested out on folks that maybe have less resources to complain or do something about it. And now maybe that is changing, because now if I'm a white collar professional and being surveilled, maybe there'll be more pushback, which I think hopefully will push back against, this more broadly, so.
Yeah. Well, so you're clearly in this industry because you think it's worth doing and it's going to better society. So, if you project into the future a little bit, like where your industry is, knowing how AI is evolving, improving, along with regulations that may or may not be effective, like what is your sort of ideal end state? Where do you see this sort of tech being used in its most optimal, best way possible?
Well, I mean, I think, like our industry is very much like the automotive industry. I mean, the automotive industry has, cars and trucks and all the stuff that are incredibly polluting. And then again, like, it has electric vehicles and everything in between, right? So I think that our industry has a tremendous amount of, variability or heterogeneity. And I do think that, like, in terms of sort of responsibly built tools that, don't have disparate impact level, like, I think that, the proportion of HR tools that are like that is probably similar to the proportion of electric vehicles that are sold. It's definitely a small minority, just to be clear, right? So I think there's a lot of work to do. And I think, again, it's just like with big oil and everything else, like, I think, there's just so much inertia about like, oh, well, we've done this forever and it's too hard to change and our product is built this way and like blah, 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 and so again, like, what is it going to take to move things in a, more quickly in the direction of people building products that, really eliminate or, minimize as much as possible, racial bias, gender bias, disability bias, all that stuff. I think I'm not sure what the answer to that is. Just like, I don't know what's going to propel everyone to have an electric vehicle. Right. But I'm hopeful that that is a direction that, at least some of the market is looking for, and some of the market is taking. I mean, I do think that, like, just like with electric vehicles, like there's a lot of, there's actual true economic reasons to be doing this. Like, we always we don't really have to make the case to our clients, but we always make the case in market that, like, look, like using tools that are poorly designed, that have a lot of disparate impact, you're really just artificially narrowing the pool of people that you're looking at. Like, why do you want to do that? That's just kind of dumb. It's not very smart, like, I mean, and I think people are starting, hopefully, more and more to resonate with that message. But I think, like, I think it's a slow road. And I think it's frustrating for any of us that really want to be in this industry, because we think it has the potential to really improve things. I think it's frustrating how slow things can be,
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's so one final question, actually.
Yeah.
So I would be remiss if I didn't ask about these large language models, only because there's just this huge, like, explosion now of interest in AI, worry about AI. Like, those of us in the bubble have, it has felt like this has been a long time coming.
Totally.
But now everybody and their cousin at dinner table is talking about this. What do you see as I don't know, what are your thoughts on this recent emergence of interest, the capabilities of these tools, how they might affect like, what are your thoughts in general of what's happening right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that it kind of took everyone by surprise, right? When these tools were launched, because people were like, holy shit, excuse my French, like, this is not, like, even I, who live in this field, like, I wasn't imagining that we'd have this sort of explosion of these tools, and how, quickly they'd be adopted and all the rest of it. And, like, Timothy Gerbrew and others, Mike Mitchell, like, have, obviously did a lot of work in terms of exposing, like, the problems with these large language models. And we know the whole brouhaha that happened there, right? So I am concerned. I mean, again, it's just back to this whole concept of, like, bias and all of these challenges have existed for eternity. I mean, like the world has become less biased, but the data that still exists, largely is a history. It's a record, a human record of bias, right? And so obviously anything that is trained on that. Now, what I've heard as a counter argument is like, well, we can make these things smarter. We can, only train them on certain things. Like it's the same as sort of saying like you can debias HR models. Well, you can, but you have to be incredibly careful about the data that you're feeding it and what you're doing. And like, you know what I mean? So like, can we do that? Sure. Will we do that? Highly questionable in my mind, right? Because then it just goes back to like, who's building these tools, what's the economic incentive, like et cetera, right? And I think Alex Engler made this point one time, like where he said, like, it's totally possible to build things that are responsible and well built, but it just takes more resources, more time, more care. And unfortunately, that like the best product isn't always the one that's going to like dominate the market, because the one that dominates the market is the one that's just like built like Facebook, move fast and break things. So there's that continual tension behind building something that is built well and responsibly, et cetera, versus, just dominating a market and putting out whatever's out there. So
do you see it any disruption in the sort of hiring tech? Like is this going to change? Are you expecting a bunch of new companies to start cropping up around these tools?
I'm sure they're going to crop up everywhere. Have I thought of like the application in HR? I don't know. Maybe they're going to respond to the chat bots that everyone's using now.
Yeah.
That's a thought. Like, how will a chat bot know if it's you or, Dolly? I don't know. Like that's one way that I could imagine it happening.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating time because, the concerns that a lot of us have, concerns and interest in, I think to say like I'm a big skeptic of AI in the sense that it's my job to focus on the risk. But in the end of the day, I know that AI is going, whether I like it or not, going to transform our world.
Yep.
And so, it's interesting to see a lot of people getting into this field,
Totally.
being interested in it.
For the first time. Yeah.
For the first time, realizing like, oh, wow,
Totally.
this is going to affect my life and my kids' life. And
Totally.
maybe I should pay attention to it. So it's an exciting time to be alive. It's an exciting time to, slightly scary. But it's interesting to see. It will be interesting to see how it disrupts a variety of industries, if it will.
Sure. Well, no, I think it's not an if, it's an absolute, it will. I think again, it's just back to then like, hopefully we've learned some lessons from, other tech that has had a lot of unintended consequences. And again, we know how to build it. That's the thing that's super frustrating. I think it's not like people don't know how to do these things better. It's just they choose not to, out of, again, a whole bunch of reasons that relate to the baser of human elements,
Yep, that's right.
So,
well, thank you so much for joining us. I think we're about out of time. So we'll have links in below for you and where you live on the interwebs. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Thanks everybody else for showing up, and we'll see you on Lunchtime Babbling next time.
Sounds good.
Bye.